Sorry, I guess I probably should have done this first. Um, so, my name's Scott Hansen. I'm from Grand Rapids. I've done this since like 2017. Here's a picture of me and my son. I have a website that I have these slides, and I have a bunch of other stuff if you're interested too. Um, so when we talk about putting a controller in xLights, the things we need to think about are the mode of operation of the controller, the type of controller you have. Do you have an FPP based controller? Do you have a Genius based controller? Falcon, what do you have? Your network setup matters too. I'm not going to go into that too much tonight. I'm just going to kind of assume you have a flat network. We need to know about models, what ports, number of ports, smart receivers, and if you're going to do DMX or something like that. So I'll just do a quick, what's the modes of operation of controllers? Most common, most sometimes referred to as bridge mode or just E131 or DDP mode. You have a controller that receives data from FPP like a Pi or a computer running X schedule. It outputs to lights. This is the most common mode. Every controller will probably support it. When we talk about this bridge mode, there are a couple protocols out there that are used. You'll hear E131 or ArtNet. That's basically like DMX over Ethernet. Very common. Every controller will support that because it's used in theater equipment. It's used in our hobby. It's used to all. It's pretty standardized. A more newer protocol that you'll see in our hobby a lot, but you won't see in like theater and other stuff as much is DDP. A lot of older controllers don't support this, so if you have really old like SAN devices, Alpha Picks, they may not work. But any of the modern controllers support it. So if you're using like a Culp, Genius, Falcon, V4, V5, WLAD, ESP, Pixel Stick, they all support DDP, so I would use that, or we'll use them in like master remote mode, which we'll talk about here. The other way, if you're using, this mostly works with FPP based controllers. Other controllers like Falcons do support this as well, but it's called master remote or multi-sync mode. The concept is we'll have a master or a main player. It's like a conductor. It'll send out data to the other controllers, just sync packets instead of like all the data. And they'll basically all just be synchronized with these smaller packets instead of the data all over your network. The one thing about this is we have to upload all the sequences to all the controllers, which if you're using FPP Connect is not really that big of a deal. So another consideration, smart receivers. Are you going to daisy chain them? Or are you going to do them by themselves off ports? How are you going to configure that? This diagram is from Wired Watts, and it kind of illustrates when we do smart receiver chaining, you almost need to think about how the data is kind of put in the controller. They're almost like they're all on the same port. So like we have three smart receivers here. And I think Wired Watts calls them pools. If you go to the Hinks Picks website, he calls them streams. But your controller has the four ports, and all of the pixels on port one on all of them are on the same stream or pool. So if you're going to hook up pixels on three receivers, this has to be under your 800 max that you're doing at 40 frames a second or 1000 at 20 frames. So when you think about streaming, you kind of have to think that they're all in line with each other. And if you're doing Falcon-based smart receivers, they all have to be smart. You can't have like a dumb at the end. You can do that with Hinks, but I'm not going to talk about that. And when you do use smart receivers, you lose a couple pixels. The V2 protocol is like 25, so it's not a huge number, but it's 90 on the older V1 protocol. So we can kind of use a lot of these concepts all in together. So we could have a master player with remotes. We could also have some controllers in bridge mode. We could have other ones in remote with smart receivers. We could have DMX hanging off our controllers. Depending on how complicated you want to get, you can kind of use these all in together for your show. So you don't really have to worry if you all have geniuses, if you're all Falcon, you can have mix and match different brand controllers. And normally, as long as you have some master player, you'll be able to send data out to them. So xLights, my favorite thing. I just say, and you'll hear everywhere, just auto everything. So in newer xLights, well, I guess newer since like 2019 at this point, xLights will just auto figure out all of your start channels, your size, and everything. So once you enable a controller, you put the vendor, the model, some don't have variant. You can then set auto layout models, and that's the checkbox that basically tells xLights to move things around and auto do the start channels. Then you have auto size and then full xLights control. Not all controllers have full xLights control. It's kind of a full xLights control just means xLights will basically wipe out all the data in the controller. And sometimes some people want to mix and match, do a little bit of uploading with xLights and manually configure. It's a very limited use case these days, but in the early days it was. So full xLights control, if you disable it, you can do some kind of more advanced stuff, but I would keep it enabled for most. And then there is some other settings that we'll go over a little bit. Kind of the primary way most people configure their controllers using the visualiser. You have a list on the right here where we'll have all our models. We drag and drop them, or you can double click to move them to put them on your controller. There's also discovery. This will attempt to find controllers. Sometimes this is good in a pinch if you can't find them, but normally I would just manually set them up because sometimes discovery can just find everything kind of randomly. Here's kind of like a list of most of the controllers that work with xLights. There's even more now. There's some other newer ones out there that I don't have listed on here. And if you have some of the WLED based ones from different vendors, there's even a whole another list. Okay, well that's hopefully enough death by PowerPoint. We'll just jump into xLights. So basics in xLights, I assume most people know. You have your 3 tabs: controller, layout, sequencer. So controller is where we do all of our controller stuff. There's 3 buttons here: add USB, so we can also do like local serial outputs if we wanted to. I'm not going to talk about that. Ethernet is basically any Ethernet based controllers, which is pretty much everything most people use. Your Falcons, your WLED, everything like that's Ethernet. And then null is just kind of a block of random channels just for debugging, or for like a lot of sequencers use it for just creating sequences dummy layouts. So first thing normally you do is just add an Ethernet one. So it'll add a line. All the settings that kind of matter for controllers are over here on the right. I think Alex at some point made it so you can't resize this anymore, which is a little annoying. But so kind of top down is where you want to start putting the settings. The name, this is what is going to be kind of like the key that's used for all of your auto start stuff and when you'll see it in the layout. So it can only support certain characters, and it has no spaces. So I normally just say this is like house left or something. Description, now this is where you could put more verbose information, and this is just kind of for yours. So if you want to say this is my F-16 under the tree or something, you can put that in there. But below that is then kind of the important stuff, and a couple years ago I actually moved this up more because I thought it was more critical to do it first. But the first thing is a vendor, so this is all the controller vendors. They should be alphabetized. So depending on what type of controller you have to just pick your vendor. For tonight, I'm just going to do one of my controllers. So you pick the vendor, and once you do that, you'll then get a drop down for model, which this will be the model of controller. So if you have like an F16 V4, you would put that in there. And then most controllers then have what we call a variant. And this allows for options where you can say if you have expansion, no expansions. So if you have like a F16, you can have multiple expansions, kind of more add-ons. So once we set that, and by default, once you add a controller, it will just auto enable kind of like these preferred options, the auto everything I was saying. There are some pop-ups here that kind of tell you more information about it. One thing, so if we're using this in bridge mode, there's this active, and this is kind of important for if you're using bridge versus master remote. So if this is set to active, basically it means if we upload to FPP or we use xScheduler, this is going to send data to the controller over the network, like either DDP or E131. If you want to use master remote and you want this to be a remote device, you're going to want to put this as xLights only, because that basically just says when we're debugging xLights, it'll send data, but when you're doing playback in FPP or xSchedule, it won't send data and it'll just do the master remote packets. So I normally do master remote for my whole show. So that's kind of what I normally have selected. This is the IP field, and this can also be the host name. It can be IP/host name. There would be some debate if you should use host names versus IPs. I personally use IPs. Host names can sometimes be a little unreliable. So here's my controller I have. I'm just going to copy. It's 205 is. So we type in the IP 192. So that's my IP. If you're doing some kind of proxy or going through another more advanced stuff, there's the proxy field in here. And the other thing I mentioned a little bit is the protocol. If you're doing a FPP based controller, so one of my controllers or a culp, it'll automatically select DDP because that's kind of the preferred. Same with Geniuses, and I think even now Kyle added it, so it does it for WLED as well. So you can do E131. There is some reasons people do that, but I would just keep it to DDP. And the thing is when we're in master remote mode, this DDP isn't really used. It's only used in testing, because when this is a remote, no data is being sent to it over the network anyways. So it's not really used in master remote anyways. Keep channel numbers. That's a little important for WLED and ES pixel stick ones. You need to uncheck that, or Kyle's made that now so that auto unchecks. But there is something in there. It's about the DDP start addressing to make sure if it's absolute or not absolute, and some controllers don't support absolute. So I was going to. So kind of on my network right now, I have. This is my BeagleBone based controller. That's a pixel controller. I have my master FPP here, and then I have a P5 panel. So as well, we will want to set up that P5 in here as well. I'll just call it P5. And for P5s, you normally do FPP, and then LED panels. Again, just kind of leave everything auto. Put the IP in, and we'll make this xLights only, because again, I'm going to do master remote with it. So, and if you're running a xLights from this year, I made it so now there's all these columns up here so you can kind of see all these settings that I feel like are important a lot faster. The other thing you can do is you can just add your master as a controller. I personally don't do that, but if you do that, it does make sometimes FPP discovery a little bit easier and better. So that's a thing you can do, but well, let's just do it for fun. See what happens. So this is my main FPP here. So let's call this main. Again, for this, there's a model called just FPP player only, and it kind of disables everything because in theory, you're not going to be outputting any lights on it. And this is 5. You can also, in theory, like I could use my P5 as a master as well. That's a valid thing. You can have props and stuff off your off it as well. Sorry, I see a bunch of things in chat. I'm not really watching any of those questions or just people saying I'm wrong. Okay. Anybody even hear me?
No, you're good. Keep going. Go.
You're good. We're just
It's
happy.
Alex teasing you.
Alex, I'm sure he knows more than me. Okay, so I just have an empty layout here, and we'll just make some props, do some random things to show off. Ooh, I drew one small. Just make a quick layout here. Let's say like the globe. It's Alex's. So just threw some kind of random props in there. We can show as well. So right now I just have kind of 4 props. If we were doing DMX and some other thing, DMX, we could put that in here, and we can also show how to address this in the visualizer. So visualizer, you can hit the button over here, or secret, you can just double click. It's you open it up for the controller here. There is an option up here to hide if it's on some other controller. So if you don't want to accidentally drag off another controller, you should have that checked. There's some options down here I added for sizing. So depending on your screen, how well your eyes are, things like that. There's some little drag dialogues. Down here is kind of like the diagnostics box. This will basically tell you errors, warnings, anything like that. So if you see something down here, that's normally something you need to fix. So other things about the visualizer, there's these little 4 groupings. On some controllers, like this is my controller is 16 ports local, and then I have the expansion on there. It doesn't make sense that the first 16, they're just local, so they still have the coloring because it's just global, but the little 4 colors is for grouping for if we were doing smart receivers or receivers in general. So after 16, if you had a 4-port receiver plugged in, this is the 4-port, and it's just a way to kind of look at the grouping. So you can see where your receivers are. Once we go through the pixel ports, then you have your serial ports where we could do DMX. One thing to know is there's right clicks for a lot of stuff. So on certain controllers, if you're changing the pixel protocol, like if it's WS2811 or you're changing to something else, you can go in here and change. The FPP ones don't support anything but 2811. They do, I think, do UPC. There is one other one, which I'm curious why that's not in there. There's some other options to move models, which we'll show here in a second. So first thing, let's just drag a tree. And one thing to kind of look here, so I just clicked and dragged, and you can see this one is also purple. So when you can also just double click and it'll go away. And if you want to double click again, the purple one outline is where it'll go to. So when I double clicked, it hit the purple box. So if you had a whole bunch of things in line, you can kind of, so look, if I wanted all these arches on 17 here, I could just, double click, double click, double click, and it puts all 4 in a row. So it's kind of a quick way. You can also drag these. You see the little blue. So that'll say, do you want it after or before? So if I wanted 4 before, I would drag it there, and it switches 3 and 4. And you can just kind of move them around that way. So there is a pop-up here, and one thing that's important about the pop-up is the first string on something is kind of the primary string, so you'll have more information on the first string. So if you look, it has the model chaining, the controller name, where if we go to the second one, it doesn't have the model chaining information. And this is the same with the right-click menu. If you have right-click on the first one, you'll have more options than the second one. There is no real options, just the generic ones. So if we right click, we have all the options. We can set brightness. These are kind of the controller settings. We can do smart remote stuff, which we'll talk about. And so like in theory right now, this tree is 16. If I wanted this to be not 16, there's a couple ways you could change it. Historically, the old way you would do is you'd have to go back into the layout and fix it. I added this option where it does change string count. So right now we're 16, but if we want to do 8, what it does is it changes it to 8, and if you see, it actually doubled the pixel counts. So if we go back to our layout now, it's still the same 16 strands as it was before, but what it did was it doubled the pixels, it added a fold, so now they go down and up, and made it 8. So that's kind of a quick way that I added that. I made the assumption that if you had 16, you wanted to go to 8, you still wanted the proportions of the tree to be the same. So under the hood, it'll just change it for you. There's a similar thing if we do a custom model. So I put this snow globe. It's 1 string count. Well, what if I wanted this to be 3? So again, it'll take, on a custom model, it'll take the number of LEDs, the max, so there was 750, and it just divides it by 3. And if you go back then to this, you'll see strings, and it does 3. If you want to do custom sizes, like you want to do 200, 400 or something, you could come in here and change it. But by default, it just divides it evenly. So similarly, like if I now want to change this to 2, it'll try to split it evenly into just 2. So any the string count changing works with custom models, trees, and matrices. Some of the other ones it doesn't really work with because you kind of can't tell what you're doing or what you want to do with them, but on some of the simple ones, I implemented it. So let's do something similar here. So we'll change this to 3 and so I basically put one snow or on one flake on one, and they're kind of after each other. And what I was saying why we have these colors here is we can then do, this is basically one receiver if we have receiver ports. So if you have smart receivers, there's a smart remote option. I guess I don't know why we call them smart remotes, smart receivers, same thing. But so on the first one here, we can set this to A. And what it'll do, it's a little confusing, is it put the first one in A and made this box for all the A ports. And then now this is red because we haven't set it. So the one that was afterwards now got moved to the forward. It's a little confusing. And it's red because we didn't set a smart remote yet. So it's like, hey, you can't have a non-smart remote with a smart remote. So we can go to the second prop and set that to B. It'll kind of change the order back again. You'll see how this is this is 1 and now this is 2. And they're using the 3 strings. And kind of how I said earlier, you can see there's more information in the first boxes. Like the first string always has the most option. You'll see the smart remote type, the smart remote cascading, which we'll talk here in a second. And it'll show, A, B. So right now I have my tree as 8 here. With my controller, this doesn't make much sense, but if you had a full smart remote based controller like F16, we could set this to A, and let's say set the star to C. Now, if we want this tree to go on to 2 smart remotes, so right now we're 8 ports, but what if we wanted this to be smart remote A and B? We would go into the smart remote options, and there's this cascade remotes option. So cascade is kind of like going down the ports, which, as I kind of shown here, is this. Cascading would be going down the ports. So if you have 3 or 2 you want to use, this is how we would do it. We would go to cascade remotes, set to 2, and now this will go string 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first remote, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the second, and we can drag the star if we want it to be on B, or we can set the star be on, like if we had a smart remote C. So now this would basically kind of match this picture. You would have A, B, C, your 3 remotes all daisy chained, and how they're kind of pools slash or streams, the count on all 3 smart remotes still must be under like that 800 if you're using 800 per port.
Where's string 5?
That's 5. That would be on. So right now, I'm assuming like a Falcon type system where you would have 1, 2, 3, 4. There is an option called cascade down the remotes. If you're using like a Hinks Pix, this is a better option. You can use it on a Falcon. It doesn't really, it works, but if you do cascade down remote, which I enabled here, now you can see it put 1 on smart remote A and 2 on smart remote B2. So you kind of get like a zigzagging. Maybe that's easier to wire for you, but I guess most of the time I think it's probably better to wire, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first remote, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the second remote. So, but we can also set our brightness. So right now if we hover over this, it doesn't show any like brightness or gamma. It only shows them if you set them. So let's say for this model we want to set it to 30. Now, since we set it at the very bottom there, it'll show 30 in the hover. You can also clear it. Like personally, if you're using controllers that support the full, there's just a default brightness in here, and if you set this at 30, then everything will be 30. So you don't have to set it in the visualizer per prop. But if there was some, like if you had like seed pixels or some other type of pixels, maybe these are glow arches, and you want to set those to 100, you could override and set the brightness to your arches to be a little higher and override this 30, which is the quote unquote default. Again, there are some other right click options. So if you go on the headers, so these are, I kind of call them the port headers right here. There are some to move. There's some options here to basically remove all of them from that port. So that'll just, remove everything and move all models to a port. This is kind of useful. Like, oh, I want to switch ports. So I can just go 18, it moves them to 18. If you have, receivers and you're trying to, move them around, it's an easy way that you can move them to different receivers. There also is some options for setting remote type. So if you're using like a Falcon or an FPP, on each port you have to use the same type of smart remote type. So when I set these, it just defaults to, right now these are all set to V1 smart remotes, which are the old white style ones, which is probably not what you're using these days. Most people use the V2 newer ones. I think maybe we should add a setting to make it so we can default to the newer ones, but that might be an interesting feature. So we kind of have to go through and set them all. Well, there is an option to just set the remote top if you go on the header here. So if we go onto the header and set it, and say we have V2, now this will set it for all the models on that port. It is a little annoying. It doesn't do the group of 4, I don't think. That's what I just noticed. It didn't do the star, which is a little odd. I thought it would. But you'd think it, oh man, it should do all of them in the group. That's interesting. Okay. But so if we want to change all these smart remote types, we can just click on the header and set them. And it, in theory, should do all of them that are on that port. So it'll do all of them that are on 21. You have to set the smart remote on every model. That's a kind of a feature about it. So when you do it on the port, it just does every model on that port for you. So that's what we could do as well here for this one. We could say set the remote type. And they're not smart remotes right now, so it actually doesn't do anything. But then when we do hit this, put them as a smart remote, it would add them. There is another option on here as well. It's called set remote ID and increment. So what this does is I can hit A, and it basically assumed, since we had 4 models, you're going to have 1 model on each smart remote. So it set your smart remote IDs that way. If you don't want that, I wouldn't use that feature, but it's like a quick way if you have a bunch of arches or something and you just want them to be you want them to be A through G, or but you can also just hit remove smart remote, which is only there when you have a smart remote, and it just removes them all too. There are some options for nulls, color order, group count. Those are kind of controller specific things. So if we want to change, if we wanted to have some start nulls, then when we upload to the controller, you can see this is in the pop-up. That'll also get uploaded to the controller. So let's just drag and drop. The last thing here is I just have this moving head. As I said before, there's serial ports down here on the bottom. So these can be configured for your DMX type devices. So when you're down here, instead of pixels, it actually shows channels. This is like the raw channel count, and it'll show you that this is set to DMX. Again, we could change the protocol. This is an older controller that only supports DMX and PixelNet, which is an old thing. But if you're using a Falcon or something newer, you could also change this set protocol would let you change it to like Renard or some of those other protocols. Other thing in this box is a little unique. It shows the channels and then it shows the one. This is the DMX start address. So we can set that. So if we're using moving heads or we're using floodlights and they actually are like DMX channel 10, you would set that in there. And now this 10 is your DMX start channel. There is some options. I didn't add multiple heads, but you can set it up so we set the first one as 10 in chain, and then it'll take the number of channels in that model and increment it. So then the next one would be 18, and it'll do a bunch of them if you have a bunch of things on there. But I'll just put it back as 1. Other options in the visualizer, there are remove all models. I don't know if you would ever really do that, but if you want to just clear this quickly, there's an option to print. So I'll be the first to admit this isn't great, but you can basically print, and I would print a PDF. Like this will basically print your controller layout, or it'll crash. Maybe not. So once we do that, it prints literally just a PDF of all of your pixel ports. It does tile the pages, so like this is the first page, and then this is the second one, which is over here, which is basically blank. So it does make kind of a mess. I always hope to fix that better, but I have not. The option I normally personally use is, some people just print screen this, but you can also save as a CSV. So if we save this, it pops up with options to add kind of more properties. So by default, it just puts the prop name, the port it's on, and the smart receiver. If you want to add more information, like you really care about start channels or pixel counts or port current or model descriptions, like in my layout personally, I actually put the color of the cord, the length of the cord as a description. So I usually normally do this, because then it'll say when I hook up this prop, I use a 25-foot cord, and that's in my model description. But if not, you can just leave them all unchecked and it'll do the default options, which once we do, there's a little trick here. If you actually double click your, if you double click that, it actually opens your show folders in Windows Explorer. So if you double click, it's a little secret that I put in there maybe a year ago. But this opens a CSV, which can be opened with basically Excel or an Excel type derivative. And this will show your layout similarly as the visualizer. You'll have port 1 here. It'll show your models, and it shows, remote A, remote B, and that's your strings on your tree, our snow globe, and then like the showstopper snowflake as well, A and B, our moving head. So now if you can come in here, and since you have Excel, you can format this, do whatever, and then you could just print this out and put it in your box if you need to. There's also another option. I have a theater background, so in the theater there's something called a hookup list. So this is my attempt to make a hookup list, which is under Tools, Export Controller Connections. And this as well exports as, it's not just a CSV, it's a little bit more advanced. It's actually an Excel document. But similar to the CSV, this puts all your controllers and your connections as well. And if you have multiple controllers, it puts them down here, which it attempted to do, but they're empty. So I did want to show that. I forgot to put one in my layout. But let's say we have a matrix, and this is going to be our P5 panel. And normally numbers of strings is your horizontal resolution. Or, yeah, up and down. Is that horizontal, vertical? It's your vertical. And then nodes per string is across. So if you have like 32 by 64 is the panel size on P5s, you set that. You want direction as horizontal, top left is probably fine. We can, if you don't want to use the visualizer, you can actually set the same settings in here. Like this is basically what the visualizer is doing. It's setting the settings in the model pad panel here. So you can say this is on my P5. And well, that's interesting. Well, I guess you can't set them in here. Oh, it shouldn't crash like that. That's interesting. Okay, so I set up this P5 controllers as LED panels. So when we visualize this, we do get the LED panel output. So we should be able to take, if this is our P5, drag it on there, and that'll put our P5 panel on the controller. Like I was saying right now, this is unchecked, so it shows all the models that are on the other controller. If we check this, it basically hides everything that's already assigned. So now you can see everything is assigned to one of the two controllers. And now in theory, once you have this configured, you would upload to the controller. You'll get a done message. We can open it up, go to our outputs, and you should see the description match like the model names in xLights here. So we had the tree, snow globe, single lines, arches, the showstopper. And on the showstopper, it actually changed it to, smart receiver 2, put the smart receivers in here, all that for us, and it set up the DMX as well down at the bottom. So I guess that's kind of the visualizer in a nutshell. I know one thing, if you have like 16 port smart receivers, if you have like the SR 4 is what I think Falcon calls them. It's actually just 4 smart receivers like you would do in here. So right now I have it as 3. This would basically be your 4, and you would just assign 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's what, if you actually look on the smart receivers, they show that on the silk screen. Yeah, I guess that was kind of all I wanted to go over.
Scott, I got a question.
Sure.
I have a mega tree that uses 2 SRX2s and 1 SRX4. So that gives me basically 32 output ports. So I want each string of my tree is 32 strings. So I want to have each string go to individual ports. But how am I to do that in the visualizer? It doesn't. It won't let me do that coming off the same FR48 port.
Well, so you can only do 6 smart receivers. So when you have an FR, you said you had FR2 and an FR4, that counts as 2 and 4. So you can only put on one port in the visualizer. You could put a FR2, which would be A, B, and then you could do a 6, which would be C, D, E, and F. That's all you can do. You can only put 6. Like, it's not 6 receivers, it's like 6 receiver banks or chains or whatever you want to call it. So you can't, like, when it says 6, an SR2 is 2 of those 6, and SR4 is 4 of those 6. So you can only do, it's not 6 remotes, it's 6 of those like banks.
Right. So
So
there's
you're
no
gonna,
way of dividing the mega tree into two different to do different
but you could do
ports
it on
off the FX.
you could do it off 2 different ports. You can't do it off one port. So like if you wanted, so let's just for demo here. Say we have 32 ports here. What you're gonna want to do is if you want it, so you have a 4, you have a 4 and 2 twos, and that's what you want to use.
Correct.
So what you would set is the cascade, you could set to 4. And let's just get the star out of here. So now when I set to 4, it goes down 4 smart remotes. So on the first port, you could put your SR4, which would be A, B, C, D, and that would be on the first port. And then on the second port, you could put your 2 SR2s daisy chained, and that would be the second port on it. So that's what kind of this cascade sets. So 4 would basically be your SR4. That's 4 is the same as an SR4 is 4 individual smart remotes, or a 2 is kind of 2 individual smart remotes. So when we set that cascade here is what would do that.
So then for you where it shows pixel on the left side, pixel port 4, way over on the left, keep more to the left there. Oh, I'm sorry, pixel 5. That's the Ethernet cord cable that would go from that smart controller to port 5, 6, 7, 8 of the F48.
Yeah, so if you had an F48, this would be, I have a picture of an F48 on here, do I? Yeah, so this would be your first port on your F48. This would be the second RJ45 on your F48.
Gotcha. So then I would chain the two SR2s together on port 1, and then have the SR4 on port 6. Oh, excuse me, port 5.
Yeah, so like this would be your 2 SR2s would be these two, and then this would be your SR4 off of its own port.
Gotcha. Perfect. That answered my question. Thank you.
But depending on the brightness and stuff that you run, you could optimize that and probably run 200 per port, right? And then you're going to cut down in half and you don't need.
Yeah, like if you wanted, I guess I just assumed 100, you're doing 32 strings, you could do a fold, kind of like Alex is saying. If you wanted, like, are you 32 strands or are you 32 strings? Because if you want to just be 32 strands around, you could set this to 16 times 2, which would then be your 32 strings, or strands, sorry. Like if you look at this in your node layout, this is your 32 by, this is 50, depending on what your up and down is, like if your strips or whatever, and then that would use less in your visualizer.
You would just have to be careful not to go over the 708 volt limit for 40 frames per second, unless he wants 20 frames per second.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That didn't look right.
What's Alex's question?
So On the tree, when you had the tree original and you put a star at the end, right? You could actually put a star, not necessarily in the last one, right? You could put it on like string one, right? And you go from there at the end of string one, whatever you do the star. You'll get an error, but that will work, correct?
So if your controller supports virtual strings, it basically, yeah, we'll just put this on a virtual string. Which, like, newer ones. I don't know if it used to show an error because you get like a channel block because basically this is in a different channel.
Yep.
It's in the middle of a channel
When
block
you
of these
originally
ones.
had it to D, it showed you that error. Slide it over to D or any no D1.
What's that I
If you
thought?
put on string 13, then yeah, you get that error at the bottom.
Yeah, it's because there's like now a channel.
Channel
There's a
gap,
block.
but
There's an error,
right.
and it's not really a huge deal, but yeah.
So does that technically not going to work on Falcons because they don't have virtual strings?
Falcons have virtual strings.
It works on my Falcon because you get the same error when you use the wide watts. Was it Chameleon P5 handle controller?
Oh, it will force right. It has virtual string, but will force in this case a virtual string as opposed to keep it a lump sum. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.